The Vanishing Letter. You won't believe what happened after Claire Hartley discovered the hidden envelope beneath her floorboards. What seemed like a simple fresh start in London quickly unraveled into a chilling mystery, one that tied her to a past she thought she had left behind. Who left the letter? Why was it hidden? And most importantly, what happened to Michael Hayes? The answers she uncovered changed everything. What would you do if the past refused to stay buried? Welcome to our YouTube channel. Before diving into this extraordinary tale, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more intriguing stories like this. Now, let's uncover the secrets buried beneath Claire's new home. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Envelope. When Claire Hartley moved into her new apartment in the heart of London, she expected a fresh start. No drama, no complications. After years of chasing ghosts from her past, she was determined to leave them behind. The quaint flat above an old bookshop had seemed like the perfect retreat. It was the kind of place that whispered stories of the past, with its creaky floorboards, towering bookshelves, and the faint scent of aged paper lingering in the air. It felt safe, cozy, untouched by the chaos she had known. She spent her first evening unpacking, carefully placing her books on the shelves, arranging her belongings in a way that felt like home. The quiet hum of the city outside was a comfort rather than a disturbance, a sign of life moving forward. She made herself a cup of tea, breathing in the steam as she leaned against the window, watching as the golden lights of London flickered in the distance. It wasn't until later that night, as she moved a chair to the side of the room, that she felt it, an uneven surface beneath the wooden flooring. At first, she thought it was nothing, just an old building settling over time. But something nagged at her, an unshakable sense that this was more than just a quirk of an aging apartment. Kneeling down, she ran her fingers over the floorboards, pressing lightly. One of them shifted slightly beneath her touch. Her heartbeat quickened. She hesitated for a moment before prying at the loose floorboard, using her nails at first, and then a small knife she found in one of the unpacked kitchen boxes. The wood lifted with surprising ease, revealing a small, dust-covered compartment beneath. Inside, nestled in the shadows, was an envelope. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the aged paper. It was brittle, worn by time, the ink smudged in places. The sight of it alone sent a chill up her spine, as though it had been waiting there, buried beneath the floor, for her to find. She turned it over, and that was when her breath caught in her throat. The name written on the front, in careful, slanted script, was Michael Hayes. For a long moment, Claire could only stare. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the envelope, the weight of it far heavier than the paper it contained. Michael Hayes. His name alone was enough to send a flurry of memories rushing through her mind, memories she had worked so hard to bury. Michael had been her first love, the boy who had once meant everything to her. They had been inseparable, bound by youthful dreams and whispered promises beneath moonlit skies. They had talked about the future, about leaving the city together, about making a life beyond the suffocating expectations of their small world. And then, without warning, he was gone. One day, he had simply vanished. His phone was disconnected, his apartment abandoned. There had been no note, no explanation, no goodbyes. Just silence, an empty void where he had once been. She had searched for him, desperate for answers, but there had been nothing. No trace, no rumors, nothing to explain why the person she had loved most in the world had disappeared as if he had never existed. And now, 10 years later, she had found a letter addressed to him. Here, in her new home, hidden beneath the floorboards as if it had been deliberately left behind. As if it had been waiting for someone to uncover it. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Who had written it? And why had it never reached him? The questions ignited something deep inside her. A flame she thought had long been extinguished. She turned the envelope over in her hands, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on her shoulders. This wasn't just an old letter. It was a key to something much bigger than she could have anticipated. Something that might finally explain the disappearance that had haunted her for a decade. She swallowed hard, debating whether she should open it. A part of her hesitated, fearful of what it might contain, of what it might unearth. But another part of her, stronger, more determined, knew that she had no choice. The past had found her again. And, this time, she wasn't going to run from it. Chapter 2. A Name in the Shadows. Curiosity consumed Claire. The envelope in her hands was frail, its edges brittle with age, as if time itself had been gnawing away at its secrets. She hesitated, her fingertips tracing the paper's delicate surface, feeling the subtle indentations where words had been pressed into the fibers. There was something almost sacred about the moment, as if she were standing on the precipice of a revelation too powerful to comprehend. She swallowed hard, reluctant yet desperate, knowing that whatever lay inside had the potential to shatter the fragile acceptance she had spent years constructing. The air in the apartment was heavy, filled with the weight of expectation. Outside, rain pattered against the window pane, the rhythmic sound syncing with the beat of her anxious heart. Claire inhaled deeply, held her breath, and finally, with a careful precision, slid her fingers under the lip of the envelope and peeled it open. The aged paper rustled as she unfolded it, her pulse quickening with each second that passed. The ink, though faded, was still legible, though smudged in places, as if the writer's hand had trembled while putting pen to paper. The handwriting was hurried, uneven, marked with an urgency that sent a ripple of unease through her body. "Michael, I know what they did to you. If you get this, don't trust anyone. I will wait for you at the old lighthouse. Midnight on the first full moon of summer." A sharp breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes darted over the words again, as if searching for a hidden meaning between the lines. The message was brief, but brimming with desperation, carrying the weight of a warning that had never reached its intended recipient. Claire pressed her lips together, rereading the letter, her mind spinning with questions. The date at the bottom was 10 years old. Her chest tightened. Someone had written this message shortly before Michael disappeared. Someone who had known something. Something important. Her gaze lingered on the single initial. Who was this person? And what exactly had they known? Claire's fingers trembled as she turned the paper over, hoping for another clue, a return address, a second note scrawled hastily in the margins. Anything. But the back was blank. Whatever story had begun in these words had been cut off, leaving her with nothing but more questions. She exhaled slowly, feeling the air around her shift, as if the past was pressing in from all sides, no longer confined to distant memories but breathing, alive, waiting for her to listen. She glanced around the dimly lit apartment, suddenly aware of the silence, the weight of the years that had passed without answers. The walls seemed closer now, the room smaller, as though reality itself was constricting under the force of revelation. The lighthouse. That was the only lead she had. A single thread connecting the present to a past that had long eluded her grasp. A gust of wind rattled the window, and outside, the streetlights flickered. Claire closed her eyes, willing herself to remain steady, but the floodgates had already opened. Memories of Michael surfaced like waves crashing against a shore, relentless and powerful. His laughter rang in her ears, warm and full of life. She could almost feel his presence beside her, the way his fingers had traced invisible patterns on her skin when they lay beside the river, how his voice had wrapped around her like a melody, whispering promises into the night, promises of forever, of love that would stand unshaken against the passage of time. But time had betrayed them. Michael had vanished, leaving nothing but silence in his wake. And Claire, unwilling but forced, had spent years convincing herself that he was gone, that he wasn't coming back. She had carried his absence like a phantom limb, something she could never truly be free of, but had learned to live with. Had she been wrong? The thought sent a fresh wave of chills down her spine. If this letter was real, if it was meant for Michael, if it had never reached him, what did that mean? Had he disappeared of his own will? Or had someone taken him, stolen him away from the life they had planned together? Claire tightened her grip on the letter, the paper crinkling between her fingers. She had spent 10 years making peace with his absence, but now, that peace felt like a lie. A fabrication she had forced herself to believe to survive the pain of losing him. But if there was even the smallest chance that Michael hadn't left by choice, that he had been forced away, that he was still out there somewhere, then she had no choice but to find out the truth. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she reached for her phone and pulled up a map. The old lighthouse stood on the outskirts of town, where the cliffs met the sea, an abandoned relic of another time. It had once been a beacon for sailors, its light cutting through the darkness to guide them safely home. Now, it was nothing more than a forgotten monument, standing against the tide of time, hiding whatever secrets lay within its walls. And Claire knew, with unshakable certainty, that she had to uncover them, no matter what it took. Chapter 3. The Man at the Cafe. Determined to get answers, Claire started digging into the past. Days blurred into nights as she pored over old records, searching for anything at all, that could shed light on Michael's disappearance. She combed through newspaper archives, scrolling through articles about missing persons, unsolved cases, unexplained incidents. Every headline that hinted at a tragedy felt like a doorway she needed to open, but more often than not, she found herself stepping into empty rooms, faced with nothing but more questions. Exhaustion settled deep into her bones, but she pushed through, driven by a desperation that refused to let her rest. She revisited memories she had long tried to bury. Michael's voice in the dead of night, the flicker of something unspoken in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. He had always seemed like he was holding something back, as if the weight of some unseen truth pressed down on him. There had always been hesitation in his words, a pause just before he changed the subject. She hadn't questioned it then. She had trusted him. But trust had not been enough to keep him from disappearing. Eventually, one name surfaced again and again. Julian Carter. Michael's closest friend, practically a brother. If anyone knew what had happened, it was him. Claire tracked Julian down to a quiet cafe tucked away on a cobblestone street on the outskirts of the city. The place exuded old-world charm, with ivy creeping up its aged brick walls and the scent of freshly roasted coffee curling through the air. A soft chime rang above the door as she stepped inside, a subtle announcement of her presence. The interior was warm, bathed in the golden glow of antique sconces. Mismatched wooden tables filled the space, their surfaces scratched and worn from years of use. A few patrons lingered, an elderly couple murmuring quietly in the corner, a lone man engrossed in his book near the window. Behind the counter, Julian was pouring coffee into a ceramic cup, his movements smooth and practiced. He had changed. The boy she remembered had been full of restless energy, always grinning, always teasing. But the man before her was different, older, sharper, carrying a guarded air that made her uneasy. The years had carved fine lines into his face, and the light-hearted mischief that had once shone in his eyes had been replaced with something else. Something darker. Something haunted. Claire hesitated, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. Would he even recognize her? Then his gaze lifted, and as their eyes met, she saw it, the flicker of recognition, the slight widening of his pupils before he masked it with a carefully neutral expression. But she had seen it. She knew he remembered. His hands stilled mid-motion, the coffee pot trembling slightly before he set it down. "Julian," she said, stepping closer, her voice steady despite the sudden tightness in her chest. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he set down the cup with slow deliberation. "Claire." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe buzzed with quiet conversation, the clink of spoons against porcelain, the hum of the espresso machine. But Julian's body was tense, his posture rigid. Still, his eyes flickered to the corners of the room, scanning, checking what exactly? Claire wasn't sure, but the unease in his expression made her pulse quicken. "I need to talk to you," she continued, voice low but firm. "It's about Michael." The reaction was immediate. Julian paled, the color draining from his face. The easygoing demeanor he had once carried vanished in an instant, replaced by something colder, something sharper. His fingers curled around the counter's edge, knuckles whitening. He shook his head slightly, as if to silence her before she could say another word. "Claire, leave it alone," he whispered, the urgency in his voice undeniable. "There are people who don't want that name spoken." A shiver crept down her spine. It wasn't just unease, it was fear. Deep, bone-chilling fear. What had Michael been involved in? What had Julian seen? "Julian, please," she pressed, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "I need to know what happened. I found something that tells me his disappearance wasn't what we thought." Julian let out a slow, unsteady breath, rubbing a hand down his face. For a moment, it looked like he might say something. His lips parted, his gaze flickering with conflict. But then his attention darted to the window. His entire body went rigid, tension snapping through him like a live wire. Claire turned instinctively, scanning the street beyond the glass, but she saw nothing, just the usual flow of people, the flickering streetlights. But Julian's reaction was unmistakable. He had sensed something. Someone. When he turned back to her, his expression was set in stone. "I can't," he said, shaking his head. "I'm sorry. Just stop looking, Claire. Let it go." And with that, he turned away, disappearing into the back of the cafe before she could argue. The walk back to her apartment felt longer than usual, her thoughts a tangled web of frustration and unease. Julian knew something. He had to. And he was scared. That night, as she sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, her phone buzzed against the table. A message. The sender was unknown. "Stop looking for him." Ice slid down her spine. She stared at the screen, heartbeat thudding against her ribs. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was watching her. Someone didn't want her digging into Michael's past. But she wasn't going to stop.
Not now.
Chapter 4. The Lighthouse Secret. Ignoring the warning, Claire made her way to the lighthouse mentioned in the letter. The drive was long and winding, the roads flanked by towering, gnarled trees whose twisted branches stretched like skeletal fingers over the path. Overgrown hedges encroached upon the narrow road, their thorny limbs scraping against her car as if trying to keep her from proceeding. The sun had begun its descent, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the cracked pavement. The closer she got to the coast, the more the landscape transformed. The trees thinned, giving way to a vast expanse of rocky cliffs and rolling waves that crashed violently against the jagged shoreline. The rhythmic, unrelenting roar of the ocean filled the silence, a haunting melody that sent a shiver down her spine. The salty tang of the sea mixed with the cool, damp air, wrapping around her like a chilling embrace. At last, the lighthouse came into view. It stood tall and desolate, a lonely sentinel against the backdrop of the darkening sky. Its white paint had long since faded, peeling away in jagged strips under the relentless assault of salt and wind. Vines had begun to creep up its base, reclaiming the structure as part of the wild terrain. The windows, some shattered, gaped like empty eyes staring into the abyss. Despite its abandonment, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching her. She hesitated at the entrance, gripping the rusted handle before slowly pushing the heavy wooden door open. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound slicing through the stillness like a warning. She stepped inside cautiously, her footsteps muffled by a thick layer of dust that coated the floor. The musty air was thick with the scent of decay, mingled with a faint trace of salt lingering from years of storms raging against the old structure. Something felt wrong. The air was too still, too expectant, as if the lighthouse itself was holding its breath. Her skin prickled as she glanced around the dimly lit interior. The walls, lined with peeling paint and damp stains, seemed to whisper secrets just beyond her ability to understand. Then, she saw them. Faint but undeniable. Footprints. They disturbed the thick dust, leading deeper into the lighthouse. Her breath hitched. Someone had been here recently. Her pulse quickened, a mixture of fear and resolve washing over her. Who else knew about this place? More importantly, why had they come? Steeling herself, she followed the footprints. The light filtering through the cracked and broken windows painted eerie patterns across the floor, casting long shadows that shifted as she moved. Her heart pounded with every step, her ears straining for any sound beyond her own hesitant movements. Then she saw it. A small wooden box rested atop a rickety table in the center of the room. It looked ancient, its edges worn smooth by time, yet the dust covering it wasn't as thick as the surrounding surfaces. Someone had placed it there recently. Claire's hands trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing the rough surface before she lifted the lid. The hinges creaked softly, revealing the contents within: brittle scraps of paper, faded photographs, and, at the very top, a folded letter addressed to her. Her breath caught. Slowly, she unfolded the note, her heart pounding as her eyes scanned the familiar handwriting. "Claire, if you find this, it means I failed. I never wanted you involved, but you're the only one I trust. Find the truth." Michael had written this. A sharp inhale escaped her lips as realization set in. He had been alive, long enough to leave this message, long enough to know she would come looking. Relief and dread warred within her. If he had written this, then he had known something was coming for him. Something dark enough to make him hide the truth in a place only she would find. Her grip tightened on the letter, her mind racing. Who was A? And what truth had Michael been so desperate for her to uncover? A gust of wind howled through the broken windows, rattling the shutters and sending loose papers skittering across the floor. The sound made her jump, her pulse hammering in her ears. She glanced around, taking in the oppressive stillness once more. The lighthouse had been abandoned for years, but tonight it felt alive, breathing, waiting. Claire exhaled shakily, folding the letter with careful precision and slipping it into her pocket. She had come seeking answers, and now she had more questions than ever. But one thing was clear: she couldn't turn back. The past had found her, dragging her deeper into its grip. Whatever secrets lay buried in this place, whatever truth Michael had wanted her to find, she was ready. She had to be. Chapter 5: A's True Identity. The search for A led Claire to Amelia Hawthorne, a once prominent investigative journalist who had been one of Michael's closest confidants. Finding Amelia wasn't easy. She had seemingly vanished from public life years ago, her articles erased, her name scrubbed from any recent records. It was as if she had never existed. Claire had to dig through old archives, scouring forgotten newspapers and encrypted databases, following the faintest of leads. She pieced together a trail of abandoned addresses, disconnected phone numbers, and outdated contacts. Each dead and only fueled her determination. After days of relentless searching, she finally found Amelia in a quiet corner of a dusty little bookstore tucked away in a forgotten alley. The shop itself was a relic of another time, its narrow aisles crammed with yellowed pages and cracked leather bindings. Dim light filtered through the old glass windows, casting shadows that danced among the shelves. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and ink, a comforting yet melancholic fragrance. Claire hesitated at the entrance, her heart pounding. She had imagined this moment countless times, had rehearsed what she would say, but now, standing here, she felt an unexpected surge of doubt. What if Amelia refused to talk? What if she was too afraid? What if Claire was putting them both in danger just by being here? Gathering her courage, she stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly, a delicate yet intrusive sound. In the back, seated behind a small wooden desk, was Amelia. She looked different from the photographs Claire had found. Her once fiery auburn hair was now streaked with gray, pulled into a loose bun. She wore thick glasses and a cardigan that was a size too big, as if trying to disappear into the fabric. But it was her eyes that stood out the most, sharp, wary, darting toward the entrance the moment Claire walked in, as if she were always expecting trouble. Claire approached cautiously. Amelia Hawthorne's? Amelia stiffened, her fingers pausing on the book she had been flipping through. Slowly, she looked up, her gaze assessing. You must have the wrong person. No, I don't. Claire's voice was steady, though her insides were in turmoil. I'm Claire Hartley. I'm looking for answers about Michael Hayes. And I think you can help me. The moment she said his name, Amelia's expression flickered. Fear. Recognition. Something deeper. She exhaled heavily, setting the book down with a quiet thud. You shouldn't have come here. I didn't have a choice, Claire said. I found a letter. A warning. I need to know the truth. For a long moment, Amelia was silent. Then, finally, she gestured toward the chair across from her. Sit. But keep your voice down. Claire obeyed, her pulse quickening. She watched as Amelia leaned forward, her fingers lacing together, her expression unreadable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. Michael uncovered something dangerous, she admitted. A corruption ring within the city's elite. He had proof, documents, testimonies, things that could have taken down some very powerful people. But before he could act, they found out. He was framed, forced to run. And when I tried to help, I was silenced. Claire swallowed hard, her stomach nodding. Silenced? What do you mean? Amelia let out a humorless laugh. An accident nearly killed me. My brakes failed on a winding road. If I hadn't jumped from the car before it went over the cliff, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. After that, I disappeared too. Changed my name, cut ties with everyone. But I never stopped looking. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just a cover-up. This was something far more insidious. And Michael, she pressed. What happened to him? Amelia hesitated, then glanced around as if expecting someone to be eavesdropping. That's the part one don't know for certain. But she exhaled sharply, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. Michael might still be alive. Claire's breath hitched. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. What do you mean? If he was alive, why hasn't he come back? Why hasn't he tried to find me? Amelia hesitated, her eyes searching Claire's face, as if debating how much to reveal. Because if he's alive, he's still running. Or worse, someone is keeping him from reaching you. The words sent a shiver down Claire's spine. She stared at Amelia, processing the weight of what she had just been told. The idea that Michael had been alive all these years, alone, trapped in danger, was almost too much to bear. Do you have any idea where he might be? Claire asked urgently. Anything at all? Amelia sighed, rubbing her temples. There were rumors. Underground safe houses, people who helped him stay off the grid. But if he's alive, he's buried deep. They wouldn't make it easy to find him. And if you start looking, Claire, you're going to make yourself a target. Claire clenched her fists. I don't care. I need to find him. If he's out there, I can't just walk away. Amelia studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. Then we need to be careful. There are still people watching, waiting. If we do this, we do it smart. I have some contacts, people who might know something. A flicker of hope ignited in Claire's chest. She had come here looking for answers, and now she had something more, an ally. Amelia reached for a notepad, scribbling down an address. Start here. But be careful, Claire. They've already warned you once. If they think you're a real threat, They won't just send messages. Claire took the paper, her grip firm. Fear churned in her stomach, but determination burned brighter. Michael was out there, and she was going to find him, no matter what it took. Chapter 6. The Truth in the Fire. Following Amelia's lead, Claire tracked down an old warehouse connected to Michael's last known whereabouts. The journey took her to the outskirts of the city, where abandoned factories and rusted-out cars lined the streets, remnants of a forgotten industrial era. The warehouse stood at the end of a desolate road, its walls covered in peeling paint and ivy creeping up the sides like nature's attempt to reclaim what had been left behind. She parked a short distance away, scanning her surroundings cautiously before stepping out of the car. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and oil, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. A chill ran down her spine, but she shook it off. She had come too far to let fear stop her now. The entrance to the warehouse was a heavy metal door, rusted at the hinges. Claire hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. The groan of metal against metal echoed into the vast, empty space beyond. She stepped inside, her breath visible in the cold air, and took in her surroundings. Dust coated everything. Old machinery sat untouched in the corners, rusted husks of what they once were. Shattered windows allowed thin slivers of moonlight to spill inside, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The cold seeped into her bones, making her shiver, but it wasn't just the temperature that unsettled her. Something felt off. Then she saw it. At the center of the room lay a pile of burnt debris. Claire moved cautiously, her steps slow and deliberate as she approached. The scent of smoke still lingered in the air, mixing with the damp musk of decay. Kneeling beside the charred remains, she reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing against the brittle edges of burned paper. Whoever had been here before had tried to erase something, documents, records, evidence of some kind. She sifted through the remnants, searching for anything salvageable. Most of the pages had been reduced to blackened fragments, their ink smudged and illegible. But then, amidst the destruction, she saw it, a single page, partially burned but still intact enough to read. She picked it up gingerly, heart pounding as she scanned the faded words. It was an address, a place she didn't recognize, but one that Michael must have been connected to. Before she could fully process the significance, a sharp noise broke the silence. The scrape of a footstep, the whisper of fabric against metal. Claire's instinct screamed at her. She shot to her feet just as a shadow detached itself from the darkness. A masked figure lunged, a knife glinting in the dim light. Adrenaline surged through her veins. She barely had time to dodge, the blade slicing through the air where she had stood a fraction of a second before. Her heart pounded as she staggered backward, scanning the space for something, anything, she could use to defend herself. Her attacker moved with precision, his strikes controlled, calculated. Whoever he wasn't just some common thug. He knew how to fight. Claire ducked another swing, grabbing a broken metal rod from the debris and swinging wildly. The impact landed against the assailant's arm, forcing a grunt of pain from him. He faltered for only a moment before lunging again, tackling her. They crashed to the floor, dust and ash billowing around them. Claire gasped as pain shot through her side, but she forced herself to keep moving. She twisted beneath him, clawing at his face, grasping at his mask. It tore free. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she locked eyes with the man beneath.
Julian.
Shock paralyzed her for a split second. The same Julian she had trusted, the same one who had warned her to stop searching. His face was twisted with something unreadable. Guilt? Anger? Fear? "You weren't supposed to find this," he muttered, voice tight, almost regretful. Claire's mind reeled. Julian, Michael's best friend, the one who had tried to push her away from the truth, was standing before her, not as an ally, but as part of whatever this was. A part of the conspiracy. Before she could react, Julian shoved her away, sending her sprawling into the debris. She coughed, struggling to regain her footing, but by the time she pushed herself up, he was already bolting for the exit. "Julian, wait," she called, but he didn't stop. By the time she reached the door, he was gone, swallowed by the night. Claire stood there, her breathing ragged, her limbs aching from the struggle. She clutched the half-burned paper in her trembling hands, her mind racing. Julian wasn't just keeping secrets.
He was part of them.
And now, she had proof. Chapter 7. The Final Clue. The address led Claire to an underground bunker beneath an abandoned estate on the outskirts of London. The decaying mansion loomed above her, its broken windows and ivy-covered walls whispering of a time long past. She hesitated at the entrance, her heart pounding so violently she could hear it in her ears. Every instinct told her to turn back, to run, but she had come too far to stop now. With a deep breath, she pushed open the rusted door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and dampness, the scent of decay clinging to every surface. The faint glow of her flashlight barely cut through the inky darkness ahead. The corridor stretched forward, each step she took stirring the dust beneath her feet, sending echoes bouncing off the stone walls. The place felt hollow, lifeless, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching. Then, at the end of the hallway, she saw him. Michael. He was slumped in a corner, bound to a chair, his body frail and gaunt. His once brilliant green eyes fluttered open at the sound of her gasp. Recognition flickered across his face, quickly followed by something else. Relief, but also fear. "Claire's?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, as if he hadn't spoken in days. She rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she reached for the ropes that cut into his wrists. Tears blurred her vision as she fumbled with the knots. "Michael, I found you. You're okay, you're safe now." But Michael shook his head weakly, his breath shallow. "No," he rasped, his eyes darting to the doorway behind her. "You need to leave.
Now."
A noise behind her made her freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The sound of someone who wasn't in a hurry, someone who knew she had nowhere to run. Claire spun around just in time to see Julian emerging from the shadows, his face unreadable, his eyes cold and calculating. He held himself with an eerie calm, as though he had expected this moment all along. "You should have walked away, Claire," he said, his voice dripping with quiet menace. "You weren't supposed to find him." Claire felt her breath hitch in her throat. "Julian," she whispered, her mind reeling.
"Why?"
Julian sighed, as if disappointed in her failure to understand. "Because he knew too much. And now, so do you?" Before Claire could react, Michael surged forward, his bound hands swinging up to knock Julian off balance. The two men tumbled to the ground, struggling as Michael, despite his weakened state, fought with every ounce of strength he had left. Julian snarled, his grip tightening around Michael's throat as he pinned him down. The sound of Michael gasping for air sent Claire into motion. Frantically, she scanned the room for something, anything she could use as a weapon. Her fingers closed around a rusted metal pipe lying among the debris. Heart pounding, she lifted it above her head, her body fueled by adrenaline and desperation. With a cry, she swung it with all her strength, the impact cracking against Julian's skull. His body went rigid before crumpling to the floor, unconscious. Michael collapsed onto his side, coughing and struggling for breath. Claire dropped the pipe and rushed to him, slipping an arm around his shoulders to help him sit up. "We have to go."
"Now?"
Michael nodded weakly, his body sagging against her. She half-carried him toward the exit, her legs shaking as sirens blared in the distance. The sound of approaching police cars cut through the night air like salvation. Amelia had kept her promise. The estate erupted in chaos as officers stormed in, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Julian was quickly subdued, handcuffed as he regained consciousness, his dazed expression giving way to fury as he realized what had happened. The police uncovered the underground operation he had been running, a tangled web of corruption, secrets, and lies that had nearly cost Michael his life. Claire held onto Michael as they stepped into the night, the weight of everything settling onto her shoulders. He was alive. He was safe. And for the first time in 10 years, she knew the truth. But the story wasn't over yet. Epilogue: Love Reborn. Months later, Claire sat beside Michael on the porch of a small cottage overlooking the sea. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the setting sun dipping lazily toward the horizon. The past was still fresh, lingering like the last embers of a dying fire, but they had survived. They had escaped, and now they had the chance to start anew. The rhythmic crashing of the waves against the shore had become their lullaby, a reminder that time continued forward, unrelenting, but also healing. The salty breeze danced around them, carrying with it the scent of the ocean and the faint fragrance of wildflowers that dotted the nearby cliffs. This place, so different from where their story had begun, felt like a world apart. A sanctuary. Michael reached for her hand, his fingers threading through hers with a warmth that chased away the ghosts that still threatened to haunt them. "I never thought I'd see the ocean again," he admitted quietly, his voice filled with awe. The wind ruffled his hair, and though he still carried the weight of the past, there was a lightness in his expression that hadn't been there before. Claire turned to look at him, her heart swelling. "You have a second chance now." "We both do." He met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw something that hadn't been there in a long time. Peace. "Claire, if you hadn't come looking for me, I would have never stopped," she said, interrupting him gently. Her voice was steady, filled with quiet conviction. "I'll always find you." A comfortable silence settled between them, neither needing words to fill the space. They simply sat, side by side, watching as the sun continued its descent, turning the water into a shimmering sheet of gold. The air smelled of salt and the promise of new beginnings. Seagulls soared in the distance, calling to each other as if they, too, knew that something beautiful had been restored. After everything, after all the danger, the betrayals, the nights filled with uncertainty, they had found their way back to each other. Michael had been broken, left for dead, but he had survived. And Claire had chosen him again and again, refusing to let him become another lost memory. He exhaled, rubbing his thumb over her knuckles. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice steady but uncertain, as if afraid to believe in the life they could have. Claire tilted her head, considering. "That depends on you." Michael's lips parted, as if weighing his next words carefully. Finally, he spoke. "I want to live. I want to leave the past where it belongs and start fresh."
With you?
Tears pricked Claire's eyes. She had spent so long fearing she would lose him again, that something, or someone, would take him away. But now, as he looked at her with a mixture of hope and devotion, she knew they were on solid ground. She smiled, squeezing his hand. "Then let's do that," she said softly. "Let's build something new. No more running, no more hiding." Michael's lips curled into a slow smile, the kind she hadn't seen in years. "Sounds like the best idea you've ever had." A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming wildflowers and sea mist, wrapping around them like an embrace. The world had given them another chance, and they weren't going to waste it. Claire leaned her head against Michael's shoulder, breathing him in, grounding herself in the moment. The warmth of him, the steady rise and fall of his chest, was a reminder that they were here, that they had made it through. For the first time in a long time, they weren't chasing shadows. They weren't running from secrets or haunted by unfinished stories. They were simply living. And as the sky darkened into twilight, their future stretched out before them, infinite and filled with endless possibilities. Thank you for diving into our incredible stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more adventures. This is just the beginning. There's so much more to come.